Okay. I tried to do some research yesterday on this concept that I found to be somewhat bothersome, and I really couldn't find anything. I couldn't find a lot of. Maybe I'll still research it a little bit more. But the idea of the takanas hashavim, of making an accommodation for a gazlan who wants to do tshuva, is such that if he steals something and then it appreciates in value while it's in his possession, he only has to pay back its value of what it was at the time that he stole it. And furthermore, if he gives back the original item, the owner would have to compensate him for its appreciation value, which, as I had mentioned, sounds a little bit, sounds strange. But again, it's got to do with takanas hashavim, that the rabbis wanted to make it easy for a gazlan to return something that he had stolen. Now, I want us to take a look at another halacha that we're going to see in the biurim, having to do with someone who steals, in a sense, but doesn't really steal, but rather they use my property against my will, and they end up improving the value of the property. So there's a basic halacha that I'd like you to see first. It's in Shulchan Aruch. Let me just share the screen. Here's the halacha, and it's based on the Gemara. It's in Choshen Mishpat Siman Shin Ayin Hey, and it basically states as follows. I hope everyone can see it. Hayored letoch sedei chaveiro shelo birshus uneta'a. If Shimon goes into Reuven's field without his permission and he landscapes, plants orchards, plants vineyards, plants any kind of vegetable patch, whatever it is. Im haisa sadeha asuyalita. If the field was just waiting for someone to cultivate it, meaning that it was really there for that purpose, it's a piece of farmland, and up until now it's been fallow, and a guy goes ahead out of the goodness of his heart and just without permission just goes ahead and cultivates it. Omdim kama adam rotza litain besada zulanota v'notel mibal hasada. So there's a halach in Shulchan Aruch that he can actually compel the owner of the land to compensate him for the land improvement. But that's only if it was meant for cultivation. If it was meant for cultivation and the guy just never got around to cultivating it, so then he can be compelled to compensate the person. And the Sma over here points out that it's only if what you're doing is bringing up the land to the same status of all of the surrounding properties, right? So let's say there are other properties in the area that are being cultivated, and this is the only one that's fallow, and he goes ahead and cultivates it, so he can send the bill to the owner. V'im eno asuyalita, shamin lo v'yado ala tachtona. But if it was never meant for that purpose, or let's say, not that it never was meant, but there's no indication that it's something that he was expected to do to cultivate that property, he's still entitled to be compensated, but at a lower rate. What we say is v'yado ala tachtona, his hand is at a disadvantage. And what the Sma explains is that there are two ways to assess, what is owed to him. One is, what is the land appreciation value now that he's invested all of this effort? And the other one is, what expenses did he put into the land outside of his labor? Meaning that he's not allowed to be compensated, excuse me. He's not allowed to be compensated for his labor because no one asked him to do it. And it's not a piece of property where there was an expectation for it to be worked upon. So, but what he is allowed to be compensated for is either the land appreciation value or the expenses, such as the the seeds or the whatever materials he used to be able to plant with, that he can be paid for, but you take the whichever value is lower. Whichever value is lower is what you charge him. So if the land appreciation is less than his expenses, you pay him the land appreciation. If his expenses are lower than the appreciation, so you pay him purely just for the expenses. Okay, so that's the basic halacha. Now, as a corollary of that, in the next halacha, it says that if the owner of the field tells him, Akor ilan chavalech, you thought you were doing me a favor by planting this tree, and now it's bearing fruit. You know what? I'm not going to pay you for it. Go get your tree. Go get your tree, and take it with you. So, Shalom. So in that case, he has a claim. Avalim Amar Hanoteya Hareni Oker Ilani. But if the guy who planted says, you mean you're only going to pay me for my expenses? You're not going to pay me for the labor and the value that I've increased in your property by giving you a fruit tree? I'm taking my tree and I'm leaving. So ein shomin lo mipnei shemakchi sha'aretz. We don't listen to the guy. We don't allow him to take his tree, because by uprooting a tree from the guy's property, you're weakening his soil. You're weakening the land. Okay, so again, it's another sign of being at a disadvantage. So on the one hand, he did this totally without permission, the guy. So on the one hand, we don't completely turn him away. But on the other hand, because he did it without permission, we don't give him full compensation. We just give him whatever is less. And he works at a disadvantage. Now, later on in this halacha, in Sif Vav, it says, Hayored l'toch churvaso shel chavero ubena'a shelo birshus. What if I go into an empty lot of my friend? This is not meant for agriculture. It's in a city, and it's just an empty piece of property. And I go ahead and I build it up. Remember, we talked about this, where a guy discovers a house that he had purchased was built on stolen property. So shamin lo v'yado al hatachtona. It's the same idea, is that he has a right to be compensated for the building of the house, but he's at a disadvantage in that either we only pay him for his expenses or we pay him for the land appreciation, whichever is less. V'im omer baal habinyan atzai va'avanai ani notel shomin lo. And here, if the builder is unhappy with the lower amount that we are willing to give him, and he says, I'm just going to dismantle the house and I'll take the building materials with me, he has a right to do that. Because in this case, he's not weakening the soil, because he's not pulling anything out of the soil that's going to weaken agricultural land and prevent it from being worked on in the future. Now, of course, I'm not sure if that includes the foundation and the underground, but here we're talking about where he's building everything above ground. It could be that halachically he doesn't have a right to uproot the foundation and do excavation. Now, Amr le bal hakarka tul mashabanisa shomilo. And also, furthermore, if the owner of the property says, I don't like this house, dismantle it and take it with you, then he has a right to say that and not pay him at all. But then the Rama writes, "V'dafki machor ve'ena asuya livnos." But that's only that he has that right to say that if this empty lot was not waiting to be developed, and it was. Anyone could argue that I would rather have the empty lot instead of having developed it. Like, for example, there are people who would say, even in a busy city like ours in Thornhill, I own the piece of property that's adjacent to my house, but I'd rather keep it empty so that I can have a little bit more space, empty space, open space. A guy goes while he's in Florida and puts a house on it. he doesn't have a right to be expected to be compensated for that project. Avali masuya livnos, abumakom shestam churva omedes livnos dino kamo chatzeros sheyisbar basam. That then, but if it's like if there was an expectation that land was meant to be developed, and it was just a matter of time before someone else would build a house on it, so then we don't say that he's at a disadvantage, but rather it goes like the next halacha, and he would have to be paid at a higher price, which is the next halacha, which is we estimate how much a person would pay in order to have this property built like this, and as long as it's it's done in the proper quality and in the proper style that the guy was happy with, he would be obligated to pay the fair market value for the construction project. Okay, so those are some examples of the general halacha of when somebody does improvement to my property, to my real estate, I can sometimes be forced to compensate him. How much I'm forced to compensate him will depend upon whether this was a desirable project objectively for all parties concerned, or whether it's something that the owner of the property could say, I didn't ask for this and I didn't want it. And then he would be forced to pay, but at a much reduced value. Okay, so now based on that, let's go back now to the Imrei Yaakov. Okay, so lahachzir hagazeh lakasaf harama simin shin ayin hey siv zayin. So the Rama writes as follows: Reuven shahayalo bayis ra'ua. Reuven has a dilapidated house. Okay, v'yatza min ha'ir. He goes out of town. Uba Shimon v'darba. And Shimon comes, and he goes and inhabits the house. V'hotzi hotzaos lahatzil habayis min hanafila v'siyado v'kiyaro. And he invests in the house and does a lot of home improvement. He invests a lot and builds up the house. I guess maybe he puts in some, if there are any termite rotted wood, he replaces the wood, he replaces the roof, he puts in new plumbing, and furthermore, he also visiyado vikiro. He then also decorates the house by painting it and plastering it. Now, those are add-ons that don't necessarily save the house from dilapidation, but rather improve the house's aesthetic quality. So kol ma shehayat l'tzarech shelo yipol tzarech Reuven lahachzir l'Shimon. So the Rama writes as follows: any work that Shimon did to prevent the house from collapsing, he's entitled to charge for full fair market value, and Reuven would have to pay him. But he doesn't have to compensate him for anything beyond what saved the house from collapsing. So if the guy decorated the house and painted it, and got what is it called? Internal decorator? No, what's the word?
Interior
decorator. My brain froze for a second. He hires an interior decorator and puts in beautiful wall hangings and tapestries and carpet and all these other things. Those are aesthetics, and Reuven could always say, I'm not paying for that stuff. Because Reuven could always say, I didn't need these expensive add-ons. I am a minimalist. I live with the bare necessities. And you went ahead and you added all of these nice things. Yes, aesthetically, they're beautiful, but that's not the way I want to live. So he cannot be compelled to pay for those things. So he says, V'lichora yesh lahakshos d'maishna zeh midin hashas bava metzia kuf aleph So he says, why is it different from the case of agricultural property, where the same siman in Shulchan Aruch says the afilu bisadeh she'ena asuya lita shomen lo v'yesh lo al kolpanim b'derech shel yado ala tachtona. He says, why is it with agricultural property that if a guy goes in and plants up the property, even though it may not be meant necessarily for that purpose of developing the agriculture, but nonetheless, the guy who went in without permission does have a right to charge, but we just say that he's at a disadvantage, but he's entitled to some compensation. He can be compensated for, if there's a differential between the land appreciation and the expenses, we give him whichever one is less, but he's still entitled to something. He says, even if he spent more money to develop it and it only appreciated, let's say, 70% of that amount, but he's at least entitled to the 70% of that amount that it appreciated the property. V'im kein lefi zeh kasha, madua ein tzarech habal habayis l'shalim klum l'shimon, harei Shimon hashbiach es beso. So the question, therefore, is, if Shimon improved the value of his house by not only preventing it from collapsing, because let's say he fixed the foundation and he replaced the beams and so forth, and he fixed the roof, right? But why is he not entitled to further compensation for appreciating the land value and the value of the home by decorating it and painting it and scraping off all of the rust and the old paint and so forth, and really, doing a beautiful new job? He says, "V'shema yesh l'chalik v'lomar, the dafka b'kerem v'sada the yesh lo lebal habayis hanaas hapero sha'ochlam o shi'achal amochram." He says it could be that maybe agricultural land is different, because if I cultivate a person's farmland, at least the owner gets the benefit of the produce that is grown on that farmland. It could be in the Ramah's case of beautifying a person's home, right? There's no produce, there's just aesthetic improvement. And perhaps that's the reason why the distinction is drawn, where the owner could say, I didn't ask for my house to be painted. I know you've appreciated its value, but you didn't ask me permission, and so I don't have to pay you. Now we note that in later on in the Shulchan Aruch, which you and I just saw a few moments ago, the Shulchan Aruch writes that Amrei Bal Hasada Akor Ilan Chavalech Shomin Lo, that if the owner of the field tells the guy, pull out your tree and get out of here, then the owner of the land has the right to say that. He says, I don't want this tree here that you planted that's bearing fruit. I'd rather you take your tree and make like a tree and leave. Okay, so because of alzeh hanasivos denira dedavka b'chay gavna sheyachol lokachas hailanos kamosha nasan ulakach yachol lomer lo eni rotze bahano azu. And so the commentary, the Nesivos HaMishpat, writes that it's only in such a scenario where I can tell the guy to take his tree, he can actually uproot the tree and transport it to another place and replant it, that the owner has a right to say, I don't want your benefit that you provide. I have no desire to benefit from the tree that you've planted. But let's say the person who provided the service cannot just uproot his tree and leave, but rather it's an improvement that cannot be extracted from the object. Kagon, so I'll give you an example. Let's say a person had a garment that needed to be dyed a certain color, and without permission, I went ahead and dyed it for the guy without asking him in advance. So in that situation, the owner can't say, I didn't want it to be dyed, so go take your dye and leave and give me back my undyed garment. That's impossible, right? You can't remove the dye once it's been put into the wool. So then mechuyev l'shalim lo adkan l'shalim. So then in that situation, the Nesiva says the owner can be compelled to pay, but at least he can argue, I didn't want it to be dyed that color. So instead of paying him the actual value of the garment and the dyeing job, I can just pay him for his expenses. Ulam lo hivanti kol kach devarav elu, demaishna beged mi bayis de kaimelan shein tzarach litin lo mashesiyado vikiro kina. But here again, I don't really fully understand, says Rav Stern. I don't fully understand the differentiation. He says, in a case where a guy makes improvements to my house, I can blow him off and tell him, get out of here. I never asked you to paint my house. Why is it that when he dyes my garment, I can be compelled to pay it some amount that he, at least the expenses that he put into the dyeing job? So what's the difference between a garment and a house? Shuv ra'isi b'tshuvas harashu hu makor dino shel harama, da'atam de'in tzarach l'shalim lo avor hasiyud hu mishum diyuchul omer lo tul eitzecha va'avanecha v'tzarchiyim. He says, I then saw that the Rush seems to say that I can always tell a guy who painted my house, take your wood and your stones and any other thing that you use to decorate my house and take it with you. But it's difficult to say that if a guy painted the house. It's one thing, perhaps, let's say he put, a brick facade or some other kind of improvement that can be extracted. So it almost sounds like that the only reason that I don't have to pay him is because he can take the materials out of the house. He says, Va'od ayin Chazon Ish. He says the Chazon Ish discusses this. So basically, he says he leaves off with Tzarchin. It's really not that simple. When a guy can blow off a person who provided him services without permission, and when you can't. One thing is clear with agricultural property, the guy can definitely be coerced to pay something, even though it's less than the actual cost of the job. When it comes to other kinds of real estate, it depends if it saves the house from collapsing. So then he can be compelled to pay him because he needed to do it anyway, or he can, unless the guy can argue, well, I was gonna demolition the house and just build something new. If you can make that claim, then it could be that you wouldn't be obligated to pay him if you're going to have to demolish it all over again. And then he writes, I want you to see a tshuva from someone called the Teshuras Shai, which is a Rav who lived in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. What would be the din if I own a Sefer Torah and I keep it in the shul, and the Gabbai goes ahead and hires a sofer to fix the Sefer Torah without my knowledge, and then he wants me to pay for it? What would be the halacha there? So I actually found the tshuva. Let me show it to you very quickly, even though I don't know if we'll have time to go through the whole thing. But at least let's take a look at the at the words of the tshuva first. I'm sorry for the poor font. Even at the beginning of the 20th century, there were publishing houses that had very poor fonts because they were still using the printing press. Let's see if I can expand this view. Zoom. No, that doesn't really help us, huh?
View options up at top.
Enlarge text onto entire page. Let's see. No. All right. Well, we'll take a look at it here. Okay, so he says, Echad hayolo sefer Torah pasul, Shehayat tzarich l'takein ha'otiot, v'hayamunach beveis hakneses. So this actually happens quite often. It's a very interesting shaila. A guy has a Sefer Torah that he dedicated, but he owns it. He retains ownership, but he lends it to the shul so the shul can use it. They found a few mistakes in the Sefer Torah. It was getting older, whatever. And so they put the gartel on the outside of the Sefer Torah, like we find a lot, and they just keep it there. And v'sachar hagabai, so it needed to be fixed, right? V'sachar hagabai sofer v'tikno. The gabai hires a sofer to fix the Sefer Torah. Uchesheno de lebal hasefer omar lo ba'ina. And when the guy who owns the Sefer Torah found out about it, he says, I don't want to pay for that work. I'm not interested in paying. The shul can pay for it. So sounds like one of our members almost. Oh, no, I'm just kidding. So the question is, so what do you do? Hine tzarachian im havi kechurva ha'asuya livnos. So the question is this like an empty lot that was waiting to be developed? In other words, a Sefer Torah that's puzzle, what can you do with it? Of course, it's meant to be fixed. The Choshen Mishpat simin shinayin hey de'ein chov l'takein imrotze legonzo k'de'isa b'simin reish ayin tes b'yoredeya. He says a guy could always say that I'm not interested in developing this. I'm not even interested in fixing a dilapidated house. Go ahead, knock it down. Maybe I'll demolish it and just have an empty lot. Ela dimikol makom habalei diyashalem v'yaragabai ala tachtona. But at least if a guy does put in the investment into the property, at least we said he's entitled to some compensation, right? If he builds a structure, but we say that he has the disadvantage of taking the lesser of the two values, right? Whether it's appreciation or expenses, but at least the sofer should be paid something, or the gabai should be paid something. Ach b'simin shinayin hey mavuar, di'yeshlomar tul eitzcha hachanami. He says, but sometimes we do have a right to say to the person who put into the improvement, take your tree and leave. Take your tree and get out of here. Hachanami. Maybe the guy who got his Sefer Torah fixed could say, take the ink and the letters that you fixed and take them out. I'm not interested in the fix. Va'aftakan asr limchok da asr la'abed kisvei kodesh. Afilu elo shein korin bahen kamo shekasav b'shut be'er sheva sif mem gimel, or simin mem gimel. He says, even though you're not allowed to do that, you can't go ahead and deliberately make a Sefer Torah puzzle. You can't say, go erase the letters that you fixed. That's halachically prohibited. Mikol makom yesh lomar demad tzarech loimar tul mashatikanta hainu im efshar litol yitol aval kan di efshar habi bal hasefer anus. He says, but maybe the only time we can say to him, take your tree, is when it's possible to take the tree. But over here, where it's impossible for the guy to take the ink that he put into the letters and the effort that he put into the letters, maybe he still has a right to say, I'm not interested in that fix and I don't have to pay anything. Va'af diyesh lomar to'enahu mevakesh v'hagabai muchzak b'sefer. And even though you can argue that the owner of the Sefer Torah is just looking for an excuse to get out of paying, and the gabai, after all, is the one who's physically in possession of the Sefer Torah, and we should therefore give him certain advantages. Mikol makom kevin da Sefer shel ba'olav bevadai v'hasafek rak al ha'hotzah im tzarech lahachzir mikiso havi bal hasefer muchzak. But still, it's clear that the owner of the Sefer Torah is the person who really is the possessor of the Sefer Torah. And to tell him that we can extract money from his pocket, maybe maybe we don't have enough power to do that. Etc., etc. And then he says, Ach yishlomar de'ein balabayis yochol la'akev milikros ba'ola hotzio below demei. Kevin da'achshav ein lomdu mitoch sefer Torah klal Elakorin bo betzibor, kishuhu kasher. Now, on the other hand, today we don't use the Sefer Torah for learning from it. We only use it to be able to read from it in the tzibor, and we only do that if it's kosher. And if it's not kosher, it really has no function whatsoever in modern society. Im kain kofin al midas dom. Uchnisa b'choshen Mishpat siman shin samach gimel sifa b'haga b'davar di boy lehanos lo yachol lehanos kofin al midas dom sheyena bo acher v'hachanami. He says, and therefore, in a situation like this, where the owner of the Sefer Torah has absolutely no benefit, no one can benefit from the Sefer Torah if it's not fixed. And the small amount of expenditure will allow people to benefit from it by using it as a kosher Sefer Torah. Maybe we could compel him using the principle of what's called midas sedom, that if you have no benefit from something, you can't benefit from it, and I put a certain amount of effort and investment in this so that now everyone can benefit from it, that for sure I can compel you to pay. And therefore, even if the owner says, I never asked for this, I can always rent it out to somebody else. But the only use that you can get from it is if it's fixed. So we fixed it. And therefore, we have provided you with the means of getting benefit from it that you couldn't have gotten had we not done this fix. Let's see. Let me just get to the bottom line. Ella de bala sefer yacholomar tenuli ba'adom mashahaya shava limkor techila kishiz damin kona kamoshuhu kidei latakno v'imlo titen li damav lo tikru ubo. However, over here, an owner also has a right to say, if you wanted to fix it so badly, you have to pay me what it was worth. What a Sefer Torah could be sold for when it's puzzle in the condition that it was before you fixed it. And if you're not going to pay me for that, then I don't want you to read from the Sefer Torah. Da'afta omad kach kama shanim v'lo machro mikol makam kevin di boy lehanos motzi lehanos ein kofen al midas dom. And it's on that basis, maybe the guy could argue, no, I was waiting to sell the Sefer Torah, and I could have sold it for, let's say, $10,000, and the guy, whoever wanted to fix it, would fix it. A lot of times there is a market for non-kosher Sifrei Torah because you sell it at a reduced rate, and then the guy who buys it invests in it and fixes it, and he could say, I didn't want you to fix it. Now let's say you put in $3,000 or $4,000 worth of effort to fix it. You hired a sofer to fix it up. I never asked you to do that. I would have been happy to sell it as is, and therefore maybe he could make such an argument. So at the end of the day, he doesn't have an answer. He goes back and forth, and he says, "I don't have an." He just that's the end of the tshuva. And so it seems like he's leaning towards the guy might be able to get out of paying. But one thing is clear, that if he ever decides to sell it, he would have to pay them for the improvement that was put into the Sefer Torah that made it, that allowed him to get more than what he would have gotten for a puzzle Sefer Torah. But it could be that the shul doesn't have a right to coerce him to pay, since the shul is benefiting from the kosher Sefer Torah. It's only if the guy were to choose to sell it at the end that he could, the shul who hired a sofer to fix it, could coerce him to compensate them at the back end at that point, where the guy, let's say, now gets $20,000 for a fixed Sefer Torah that's completely kosher, and they invested $3,000-4,000 into making it kosher. They might have a right to say, well, you have to pay us something, either the appreciation value or the cost of the sofer, whichever one perhaps is less. It's not clear whether we would say that here as well or not. But the bottom line is that they would have to, the shul would be allowed to be compensated at that point. But it sounds like he's equivocating whether the shul can coerce him to pay for something that he never requested. Okay. Anyway, we'll hold it here for today. Let me wish you all a good Shabbos, and we'll see you Imrei next week. We'll see you Imrei on Monday. Take care.
Shkir, Rabbi.